Daniel Carter, a wealthy 42-year-old tycoon, walked through the glass corridors of his empire. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty hall. His cold eyes stared out at the city's skyline, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Heirs, legacy, control. He had everything except the one thing that would guarantee his permanence in the world. A child. 2 failed marriages, women who had loved him only for his power, and an undeniable truth: he would never trust anyone again. Daniel didn't want love, just an heir. A plan started to form in his mind, cold, rational. If he couldn't trust anyone, he'd buy a solution, a woman who didn't care about his money, his influence, or his attention. Just a transaction. No emotions, no complications. That night he drove alone through rainy streets, unsure of what he was looking for. At a stoplight, his gaze fixed on a figure crouched on the sidewalk. A woman was sketching with charcoal, oblivious to the world around her. Her strokes were rapid and intense, capturing something nobody else seemed to notice. Her messy hair fell over her face, but her eyes shone intensely blue. He should have driven on, but something made him stop. Who would draw in the middle of a storm? Daniel wasn't the type of man driven by curiosity, yet at that moment he'd made the decision before realizing it himself. He turned the wheel, parked, and stepped out of the car. The woman didn't even glance at him, continuing to sketch. The details of his own face were etched on the paper. A flash of shock crossed his mind, but he masked it with cold indifference. "You." His voice cut through the rain. "Get in the car." She raised her eyes, evaluating him with a mix of distrust and indifference. "I'm not for sale." Her response was quick, without hesitation. Daniel frowned, surprised by her boldness. "That's not what I'm offering." Rain soaked her shoulders, but she seemed unfazed. "Then what is it?" He took a deep breath, as if this moment was a chess move. "A chance to change your life." Eva Mitchell didn't believe in chances. Her world was made of loss, cold nights, and forgotten dreams, but something in his voice, his calculating gaze, made her hesitate. A man like him didn't waste his time. Without fully understanding why, she agreed to get into the car. Inside, it was warm and quiet, a harsh contrast to the storm raging outside. Daniel drove silently, assessing the woman beside him. She wasn't weak. She wouldn't bend easily. That was good. He didn't need someone vulnerable. He needed someone strong enough to fulfill the contract and then move on. "You haven't asked where we're going," he commented. Eva crossed her arms, gazing out the window. "Because I know there's no escaping this." The car stopped in front of a discreet but luxurious restaurant. Eva hesitated before stepping out. This place was a world completely opposite from hers. Daniel opened the door, his voice firm. "If I wanted something you couldn't refuse, I'd have already done it. Sit down and listen." She took a deep breath and stepped inside. With every step, she felt judgmental gazes from those around her, yet she didn't back down. An isolated table, a bottle of expensive wine she wouldn't touch. Daniel got straight to the point. "I want an heir." Eva blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "Excuse me?" His gaze remained steady. "I want a child. No attachments, no bonds, no complications. You'll have everything you need during the pregnancy. In the end, you'll receive enough money to never sleep on the street again." Eva's heart raced. She'd heard many proposals in her life, but nothing like this. "You think a child is an investment?" The words escaped before she could stop them. Daniel offered a faint smile. "Everything in life is an investment." Silence hung heavy between them, filled with suspicion and something deeper, something he couldn't yet name. Eva knew she should refuse. She should stand up and walk away, but the harsh truth was that she had nothing, no home, no destination, no guarantee of tomorrow. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment she saw beyond his coldness. He too was broken somehow. But that didn't change how absurd this proposal was. "This is madness." Daniel leaned back in his chair, fingers interlaced. "Then keep living your madness on the sidewalk." His words struck precisely where he knew they would. Eva clenched. Her fists, her pride urged her to leave, but hunger and fear of the future held her in place. "And if I accept?" The question lingered in the air, sealing both their fates. Daniel smiled, satisfied. He knew she'd accept, but what he didn't know was that this contract would change everything, and he was about to lose the control he'd spent his entire life maintaining. The silence between Eva and Daniel was almost as intense as the storm outside. His words still echoed in her mind. "I want an heir." She could barely wrap her head around it. Her first impulse was to spit out a firm no and walk away. But reality cut through her thoughts like a cold blade. She had nowhere else to go. Daniel noticed her hesitation and knew he had already half won this battle. Calmly, he placed a small card on the table, a simple address. "If you decide to accept, meet me here tomorrow at noon. If you don't show up, I'll take that as a no." Ava's fingers trembled as she took the paper. Her body was tense, breathing shallow. Part of her wanted to scream that he was a monster. But another, colder truth cut through her thoughts like a sharp knife. She had nowhere else to go. Daniel sensed her hesitation and knew the battle was already half won. Without another word, he stood and left, footsteps echoing into silence. But his presence lingered, hanging over her like a shadow. Eva stared at the address in her hand. Tomorrow, at noon. Her destiny lay in that small piece of paper. She stepped outside, numb. Could she really sell herself to a man who saw fatherhood as nothing but a business investment? The urge to reject the offer clawed at her pride, yet the cruel reality of her situation drowned those protests. Where else would she go? Eva found herself sitting on a cold park bench, staring up at the towering buildings. Well-dressed people passed by, unaware of her existence, invisible as she'd always been. The world moved forward, and she was left behind. But then there was Daniel, calculating, ruthless, yet somehow broken, just like her. And a frightening thought pierced her mind. What if this was her only escape from a life of misery? The next day, precisely at noon, Eva stood in front of an imposing skyscraper, every bit as intimidating as Daniel himself. The receptionist didn't ask questions, just handed her a temporary badge and pointed to the elevator. Eva's heart raced as she approached the sleek office door. This was it. Daniel was waiting inside, standing tall and impeccable as always. No surprise showed on his face when he saw her. He simply gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." On the table, a 20-page contract awaited her signature. Eva swallowed hard. He slid the papers toward her. "Read it carefully." Her heart pounded as she flipped through the pages. Everything was laid out clearly. A child, no emotional ties, a generous payout, and the relinquishment of all parental rights. The reality of the agreement twisted painfully in her stomach. She looked up, searching Daniel's face for any sign of hesitation, but there was nothing. Just cool detachment. Eva finally spoke, unable to hold back her disbelief. "Do you think a child is some kind of investment?" He smiled faintly. "Everything in life is an investment." The air seemed heavier. Eva felt suffocated by the finality of it all. She searched his face again, hoping to find a sliver of uncertainty, but there was none. He didn't even pressure her, merely offered a choice, which somehow made it worse. After a long silence, Eva took the pen. What else did she have to lose? Her signature felt heavy, marking an irrevocable decision. She lifted her eyes back to Daniel, searching one last time for hesitation or regret, but he remained unflinching, his expression unreadable. Daniel picked up his phone and dialed quickly. "Prepare everything. Eva Monroe will move into the main residence immediately." Reality crashed over her. It was official now. Eva Monroe had just sold her future. And what she didn't yet know was that this contract was about to change, not just her life, but his as well. Daniel Carter was about to lose the control he'd spent his life building. Eva had never been in such a luxurious car. The soft leather seats were a stark contrast to the cold pavement she had slept on for so many nights. The silence inside was uncomfortable, broken only by the muffled sounds of the city rushing by. She felt like a bird about to be trapped in a cage. Daniel sat beside her, his posture perfect as always. He didn't look at her, busy instead reviewing documents on his phone. To him, this was just another business deal, a transaction to be completed flawlessly. But to Eva, it was the beginning of something she still couldn't determine was a fresh start or a prison sentence. The car stopped in front of massive iron gates. The engine purred softly before the gates swung open, revealing a sprawling, intimidating mansion. Marble pillars, towering windows, meticulously groomed gardens. A modern palace amidst a concrete jungle. Eva took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. She didn't belong there. Every instinct screamed for her to run. But run where? Daniel got out first, moving with the confidence of someone who never doubted his decisions. "Welcome to your new home for the next 9 months," he said flatly. A sophisticated woman in a tailored suit appeared at the mansion's entrance. "Eva, I'm Stephanie, Mr. Carter's personal assistant. I'll make sure your stay here is comfortable." Comfortable. That word felt strange. How could anything be comfortable when you knew it was temporary? Stephanie guided Eva inside. The mansion's foyer was immense, crowned with a sparkling crystal chandelier. Everything was perfect, controlled, without a single item out of place, just like Daniel himself. Eva felt oddly certain that any hint of disorder would be swept away instantly, and she was definitely a source of disorder in this pristine world. The assistant led her down a wide corridor and opened the door to a spacious bedroom. "This will be your space." The room was larger than any apartment Eva had ever had. Massive windows, a soft bed, a closet full of brand-new clothes, perfectly in her size. Eva ran her fingers over the expensive fabrics. Did he pick out all this? Stephanie smiled lightly. "Mr. Carter leaves nothing to chance." Of course not. A man who viewed a child as an investment wouldn't allow for mistakes. Everything had been carefully calculated. The first night passed silently. Eva lay awake in the enormous bed, feeling unreal. Just hours ago, she'd been a street artist without direction. Now she was at the center of a powerful man's carefully crafted plan. Then the thought she'd been avoiding hit her like a storm. Soon, life would grow inside her, a life that wouldn't belong to her. Her throat tightened painfully. Could she really go through with this contract? The next morning, Eva found Stephanie waiting for her at breakfast. Daniel was nowhere to be seen. Something that should have relieved her, but inexplicably irritated her instead. Didn't he even care enough to see if she was okay? "Let me show you some basic rules," Stephanie began, handing Eva a tablet. Rules. Of course. No leaving without permission, scheduled medical checkups, mandatory psychological evaluations, minimal contact with Daniel. Eva frowned. "Minimal contact with Daniel," Stephanie nodded. "He doesn't want emotional involvement, only enough interaction to ensure things go smoothly." Eva let out a bitter laugh. Does he really think a baby can be made like a business project? Stephanie hesitated. Mr. Carter doesn't believe in emotional ties. That was obvious. But why was he so obsessed with having a child? Days passed slowly, filled with medical appointments, carefully planned meals, and constant supervision. Eva felt valued, but never as a person, only as an important asset. Daniel stayed distant, busy, always avoiding interactions beyond the strictly necessary. Until one evening, everything changed. Eva was in the mansion's library, unable to sleep and exploring the shelves. Most titles were about economics, business strategies, or biographies of powerful businessmen. Nothing about art, nothing about feelings. She had just picked up an old book when she heard footsteps. Daniel. He paused in the doorway, observing her briefly before entering. "I didn't realize you enjoyed reading." Eva raised the book slightly. "I like stories, but I haven't found any here." Daniel gave a small, humorless smile. "Stories are for people with time to spare on illusions." Eva shut the book firmly. "And what do you do with your time, Daniel? Work until you forget you're human." He stepped closer, hands in his pockets. "Feelings are distractions. I learned that lesson the hard way." Eva heard something unusual in his voice. Weariness. For a brief moment, Daniel Carter seemed human, not invincible. "Have you ever loved anyone, Daniel?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. He stared at her, and for a moment, Eva saw something broken behind his carefully constructed facade, but then, instantly, he regained his composure. The stone-cold businessman was back. "No," he replied without hesitation, "and I never will." He turned and left without another word. Eva stood alone, holding the book, understanding one thing clearly. Daniel was lying. And maybe, just maybe, she would be the one to prove it. The days passed like clockwork. Eva's routine was meticulously planned, each step calculated down to the minute. She should have felt relieved by finally having stability, but instead she felt trapped. The mansion was huge, silent, and perfect. But that silence was suffocating, like living in a haunted house where nothing moved, nothing changed, and everything was precisely aligned. At the heart of this cold order was Daniel, a man who ruled everything without allowing anything or anyone to touch him. Ever since their conversation in the library, Eva had noticed something different. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Daniel avoided looking at her for too long, maintaining his usual safe distance, yet now there was a new hesitation in his gestures. Something in their brief interaction had affected him more than he wanted to admit. That night, insomnia returned. Eva left her bed and wandered through the house, exploring empty hallways until she found herself back at the library. This time, however, something else caught her eye, a partially open door at the end of the corridor. She'd never noticed this room before. Carefully, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. It was an office, not the one Daniel used for business, but something more personal. Moonlight illuminated papers scattered across a large desk. Then her eyes caught a glimpse of something else, a picture frame lying face down. Eva's heart raced as she picked it up. It was an old photo, showing a woman smiling, holding a young boy who had Daniel's intense eyes and serious expression. Before she could fully process what she'd found, Eva heard footsteps behind her. Daniel stood silently in the doorway, his gaze a mix of exhaustion and coldness. Eva took a deep breath and held up the photograph. "Who is she?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Slowly he approached and gently took the picture from her hands, placing it back on the desk. "No one." The lie was obvious. "You avoid feelings, yet you hide pictures," Eva said, crossing her arms. "Seems like there's something you don't want to face." Daniel briefly closed his eyes, visibly struggling to keep control. When he opened them, they were colder than before. "Go to bed, Eva." She knew she'd hit a nerve, a blind spot. Instead of pressing further, she turned and left him alone with his secrets. That night, Daniel didn't sleep. He sat in his office, holding the picture, haunted by memories he'd buried for years. The next morning, Ava awoke determined to understand the man who controlled her fate. As she moved through the mansion, she found Stephanie organizing some files in the living room. "Stephanie," Ava began cautiously, "how long have you worked for Daniel?" "Over 10 years, Stephanie replied, looking up from her papers. "Has he always been like this?" Stephanie gave a faint, humorless smile. "Daniel isn't the type to change easily." Ava hesitated. "But was he ever different?" Stephanie paused thoughtfully before sighing. "There was a time when he believed in more than just control, but life made sure to take that from him." Eva frowned. "What happened?" Stephanie closed the folder, looking directly into Eva's eyes. "If you really want to know, you'll have to ask him." It was clear the conversation was over. Eva spent the rest of the day deep in thought. Daniel wasn't born cold and distant. Something had shaped him into who he was. A trauma, a loss, something that made him close himself off from the world, and without intending it, she found herself starting to care. That night, during dinner, Ava finally broke the silence. "You keep me here with strict rules, controlling every detail, but you never talk about yourself." She set her silverware down and met his eyes directly. "Why?" Daniel didn't even blink. "Because my life isn't your business." Eva leaned forward slightly. "But somehow, my life is yours." He didn't respond immediately, instead, observing her carefully, weighing whether he should continue this conversation. Eventually he stood, taking a glass of wine to the fireplace. "What do you want to know, Eva?" She knew she was about to cross a line. "Who was the woman in the picture?" Daniel was quiet for a long time, the flames casting shifting shadows on his face. "My mother." Eva hadn't expected such honesty. He slowly rotated the glass between his fingers. "She was the only person who believed I could be more than just a businessman, but I failed to protect her." His confession was so quiet it almost went unheard. Eva realized this wasn't just about the past. Daniel didn't want a child solely for control. He wanted something to make him feel his life was about more than numbers and contracts. He just wasn't ready to admit it, even to himself. She stood and approached him carefully, keeping a respectful distance. "You can't fix the past with this baby, Daniel." He turned to face her, eyes filled with something he refused to name. "And you can't change what's already been done, Eva." They stood silently, an unspoken tension lingering between them. Finally, Daniel turned away, ending the conversation. Eva knew then that the wall between them wouldn't come down easily, but for the first time she saw that Daniel Carter wasn't as impenetrable as he seemed. The following days felt oddly different. Daniel never mentioned their conversation from the previous night, but he didn't entirely avoid her either. He was around the house more, crossing Eva's path more frequently than before. It felt as if something was shifting, even though he refused to acknowledge it. Eva noticed subtle changes. He would pause and watch her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Sometimes during dinner, his posture softened slightly, as if he was less concerned about keeping his cold facade. But whenever he caught himself, he swiftly reverted to his usual distant demeanor. Ava began testing these boundaries, approaching cautiously, provoking him with subtle questions and comments, curious to see how far he'd allow it to go. With each interaction, she noticed the cracks in his icy wall expanding just a bit more. Then, one chilly morning, something unexpected happened. Eva had decided to walk through the mansion's gardens. The cold wind bit her skin, but she welcomed it, needing fresh air. Along the path of smooth white stones, she suddenly spotted Daniel. He stood silently in front of a small glass greenhouse, looking at the plants inside. Eva frowned. Daniel. Carter didn't strike her as the kind of man who cared about flowers. "I didn't know you liked plants," she remarked softly. Daniel turned slowly, seemingly startled that someone had noticed him. I don't. Eva raised an eyebrow. Then, why is there a greenhouse in the garden? Daniel's gaze drifted back to the plants. It belonged to my mother. Eva stayed quiet. For the first time he'd mentioned his past without her having to pry. She used to spend hours here, he continued. She said plants taught patience. Eva watched him closely. This wasn't business. There were no contracts or cold logic here, just a memory Daniel couldn't let go of, even after all these years. And did you learn patience? She asked gently. Daniel let out a humorless laugh. The only lesson I learned was that everything you care about eventually dies. Eva felt a tightness in her chest. She knew he wasn't talking just about plants. They stood silently for a while, the wind blowing dried leaves around their feet. Neither seemed inclined to move. Finally, Eva took a deep breath and closed the distance between them. You could always try again, Daniel. He turned toward her, his eyes filled with something unreadable. Try what? Eva pointed to the greenhouse. Taking care of something, of someone, without expecting it all to fall apart. Daniel remained silent for a long moment. Then, without saying anything, he opened the greenhouse door and stepped inside. Eva hesitated briefly, then followed him. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the faint scent of plants still clinging to life. Pots lined wooden shelves, some. Flowers blooming timidly, others dry and forgotten. Daniel walked to a small table at the far end and picked up a little pot containing a nearly dead plant, its leaves yellow and drooping. This was the last plant my mother planted, he said, quietly, almost whispering. I should have taken better care of it, but I'm not good at this. Eva approached and gently took the pot from his hands. She examined the soil and felt the still firm roots beneath her fingertips. It can still be saved. Daniel stared at her, skepticism evident in his eyes. Eva smiled softly. You just need to try. Daniel stood still for a moment, then exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. And what if I fail? Eva's gaze was unwavering. Then you try again. The silence that followed was unlike any they'd shared before. Daniel didn't look away. He didn't retreat. He simply stood there, absorbing her words, as though they were harder to accept than any contract he'd ever signed. At that moment, Eva realized she was closer than ever to discovering who Daniel Carter truly was. Perhaps Daniel was discovering something about himself as well. In the days that followed, Eva felt the distance between them return. Daniel retreated into his familiar rigid posture, immersing himself in work and avoiding unnecessary interactions. Yet she could sense he wasn't the same. Cracks had formed in his armor. Eva stopped pushing or provoking. Instead, she waited, patiently, understanding what Daniel didn't. Some things couldn't be forced. Then one night everything changed. Eva woke suddenly, heart pounding. Her body felt different. A heaviness settled in her stomach, nausea gripping her unexpectedly. Rushing to the bathroom, she knew immediately what it meant. She didn't want to believe it, not yet. The feeling persisted through the day. Weakness, dizziness. It wasn't merely stress. Her suspicions were confirmed when Stephanie appeared in her room, carrying a thick envelope. These are the results of your latest tests, Stephanie said calmly, her expression carefully neutral, though Eva caught the subtle sparkle in her eyes. Eva took the envelope, hands shaking, and slowly opened it. Amid the clinical language, one word stood out clearly: positive. Her heartbeat quickened. She was pregnant. Even though she'd known this was the entire purpose of their agreement, nothing could have prepared her for the flood of emotions she now felt. Taking a deep breath, Eva looked up at Stephanie. Does Daniel know yet? Not yet, but he'll be informed shortly. Eva nodded, determination setting in. I'll tell him myself. Daniel was buried in documents when Eva entered his office. He didn't even glance up. If this is about changes to your routine, Stephanie already informed. Me? Reduce your physical activities and follow medical instructions. Eva crossed her arms, irritation rising. So, you already know. Finally, Daniel raised his gaze, cold and indifferent as always. Yes. She waited, expecting something. More. Anything. But he simply returned to his paperwork as though nothing important had occurred. And that's it? Eva's voice trembled slightly. Daniel paused, fingers tightening around the papers. He studied her briefly before responding carefully. This was the agreement. The words were sharp, emotionless, but Eva detected a subtle hesitation beneath his tone. This isn't just a contract, Daniel. He sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. Don't complicate things, Eva. She stepped closer, holding his gaze. Can you really pretend this means nothing? Silence filled the room. For a moment, Daniel seemed about to answer truthfully, but he quickly retreated behind his familiar walls. Just follow the guidelines to ensure a safe pregnancy, he said coldly. Stephanie will handle anything you need. Something inside. Eva broke. Without another word, she left the office. The following days, Eva struggled to ignore the storm of emotions within her. Every glance around the mansion, every sensation of the life growing inside her, reminded her there was no turning back. Daniel stayed close, yet distant. He supervised every medical report, instructed the staff to accommodate her every need, but never acknowledged what any of it truly meant. He insisted on maintaining control, until another sleepless night led Eva into the garden, seeking fresh air, trying to remember she was still more than just part of a contract. She stopped suddenly, realizing she wasn't alone. Daniel stood silently by the glass greenhouse, his hands buried in his pockets, eyes fixed on the plants inside. Eva hesitated before approaching him. You always come here when you need to think? He didn't turn toward her, remaining motionless. I don't usually dwell on the past. Eva moved to stand beside him. But you've been doing that lately, haven't you? His response was slow, barely audible. I'm not good at handling things I can't control. Eva shivered slightly against the cold. You can't control this baby, Daniel. He finally looked at her, his expression unexpectedly vulnerable. That's exactly what scares me. Eva held her breath. It was the first time he'd openly admitted fear. It doesn't have to be a problem, she whispered gently. Daniel gave a bitter laugh. Everything has the potential to become a problem. She met his eyes directly. If you keep holding back, distancing yourself, you might lose everything before you even begin. Silence stretched between them, charged with unspoken truths. Daniel didn't look away this time, clearly wrestling with her words. For the first time, it seemed he considered that perhaps his obsession with control was exactly what was preventing him from truly living. Before either could say anything else, Stephanie appeared at the garden's entrance. Mr. Carter, she called hesitantly. We have a problem. Daniel frowned. What happened? Stephanie took a deep breath before responding. Someone found out about Eva. The information leaked. Eva's heart clenched painfully. She turned to Daniel, awaiting his reaction, but he had already changed. The vulnerable man vanished, replaced by the familiar, cold businessman. Find out where the leak came from, he ordered sharply, and make sure it's contained. A chill ran down Eva's spine. She thought she had begun to understand Daniel Carter, but now she was certain of one thing. He would do anything to keep control, and that realization scared her deeply. The silence that filled the room after Daniel's command was almost suffocating. Eva stared at him, waiting for a reaction, any sign of genuine concern, but all she saw was calculated coldness. Daniel turned sharply to Stephanie. "Who else knows about this?" "We're still investigating," she replied calmly. "But it appears someone within the clinic leaked the information. We don't have names yet." Eva felt a chill run down her spine. Daniel's voice was devoid of emotion, coldly practical. She crossed her arms, frustration boiling up. "And what's your plan now, Daniel? Lock me in a bunker until the baby is born?" He didn't hesitate. "If necessary, yes." Eva laughed bitterly, feeling hurt despite herself. "You make it sound like I'm just another problem that needs containing." Daniel stepped closer, his eyes piercing hers. "I protect what's mine." Her body tensed under the intensity of his gaze. "And who exactly is in danger here? Me or you?" For a split second, Daniel hesitated, a brief pause that told her everything she needed to know. "You knew this could happen, didn't you?" she challenged, eyes narrowed. Daniel rubbed his temples, frustration evident. "It doesn't matter now. What's important is handling the situation." Stephanie cleared her throat gently, breaking the tension. "I'll find out who leaked the information and deal with it discreetly." Daniel nodded sharply. "Do it quickly." Eva shook her head in disbelief. "This isn't just another business deal, Daniel. It's my life we're talking about." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Exactly, and that's why I'm handling it." Eva stared at him, feeling a sudden emptiness. Was she merely another problem to solve? Without another word, she left the room, her chest heavy with mixed emotions she refused to acknowledge. The truth she didn't want to admit was that she had started to care. The next morning, as Eva sipped coffee on the terrace, Stephanie appeared, her expression grim, holding a tablet. Eva didn't need to ask. Stephanie's eyes said it all. The news leaked. Eva took the tablet, her pulse racing as she scanned the screen. Articles and rumors spread across every news outlet, speculations about Daniel's arrangement, suggestions he had paid for a surrogate. Thankfully, her identity remained hidden, for now. She placed the tablet aside, heart heavy. She couldn't just wait around, helpless. She needed answers, and this time she wasn't leaving without them. Daniel was in his office, deep in conversation on the phone when she stormed in. He shot her an irritated glance, but finished the call quickly. "Tell me who's behind this," Eva demanded. Daniel sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "We're still investigating." Eva shook her head angrily. "Don't treat me like a business matter, Daniel. This is personal. This is about my safety." Daniel's gaze hardened. "I'm very aware of that, Eva. Believe me." She hesitated, sensing there was more he wasn't telling her. "You know exactly who's behind this, don't you?" He remained silent for a moment, staring into her eyes. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost reluctant. "Yes." Eva felt a wave of dread. "Am I in danger?" Daniel met her gaze steadily. "Yes." She wrapped her arms tightly around herself, feeling vulnerable for the first time since signing the contract. "This isn't just about a baby anymore, is it?" Daniel tightened his jaw, eyes darkening. "It hasn't been for a long time." Eva took a shaky breath, realizing the situation had spiraled far beyond a simple agreement. For the first time, Daniel Carter wasn't speaking as a businessman. He spoke as a man with something real at stake. "From now on," he continued firmly, "you'll have security around the clock. Follow their instructions exactly. Your safety is non-negotiable." Eva nodded slowly, feeling both relief and anxiety in equal measure. She hadn't intended to let this man into her world, nor had he intended to let her into his. But now they were tied together by something far deeper than a contract. For better or worse, their lives were intertwined, and Daniel Carter was beginning to realize he had more to lose than he'd ever imagined. The silence that filled the room after Stephanie's revelation was thick with tension. Eva watched Daniel closely, his expression hardening by the second. She expected him to show some emotion, concern, anger, anything genuine, but all she saw was cold determination. Daniel turned sharply to Stephanie. "Who else knows?" "We're still investigating," Stephanie replied calmly. "But it appears someone from the clinic leaked the information. We're unsure how far it has spread." Eva felt her stomach twist. "So now I'm just a headline?" Daniel clenched his fists, his face impassive. "We'll contain this." The cold way he said it made her shiver. Contain it, as though she were merely another problem to manage. She crossed her arms defensively. "What exactly do you plan to do, Daniel? Lock me away in some bunker until the baby is born?" He didn't flinch. "If necessary, yes." Eva laughed bitterly. "You really think you can control everything, don't you?" Daniel stepped closer, his presence commanding. "It's not about control, Eva. If this information gets into the wrong hands, it could become dangerous. I won't take any chances." Eva swallowed hard. There was something in his voice that made her skin prickle. Dangerous for whom? Daniel hesitated just for a moment, but it was enough to tell her he was hiding something. Her eyes narrowed. "You knew this might happen, didn't you?" Daniel briefly averted his gaze. "I knew someone might use this against me eventually." Eva felt a surge of anger. "What else are you not telling me?" Daniel rubbed his forehead, exasperated. "It doesn't matter now. We just need to solve the problem." Stephanie cleared her throat, interrupting their tense exchange. "I'll find out where the leak originated and handle it discreetly." Daniel nodded sharply. "Do it quickly." Eva scoffed in disbelief. "Just like that? Give orders and expect everything to magically fall into place?" He turned to face her, eyes sharp as a blade. "Yes, because that's what I do, Eva. I handle problems." She felt a chill run down her spine. Was she just another issue for him to resolve? Without another word, Eva turned and left the room, her chest heavy with frustration and a deeper, unacknowledged truth. She was beginning to care, and that was the real problem. That night, sleep was impossible. Eva lay awake, staring blankly at the ceiling, replaying every word exchanged. Daniel had mentioned danger, enemies, threats. He knew exactly what could happen, but had hidden it from her. She needed answers. The next morning, Stephanie approached Eva on the veranda holding a tablet. Her expression was grave. Eva didn't need to ask. She already knew. The news broke. Stephanie confirmed softly. Eva grabbed the tablet, her heart racing. A prominent headline flashed across the gossip site. "Exclusive. Evia Mitchell revealed." As the woman carrying Daniel Carter's heir, Eva's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just rumors anymore. Her name, her past, it was all there. Photos of her on the street, drawings she'd made, her entire life exposed for public consumption. She felt sick. "Does Daniel know?" she asked, her voice shaking. Stephanie hesitated briefly. "He's already been informed." Eva barely had time to process before Daniel stormed into the room, his gaze sharp and furious. "Pack your things," he ordered. She frowned, confused. "What?" He moved closer, intensity radiating from him. "You can't stay here. Your face is everywhere. Anyone who wants to hurt me now knows exactly how to reach you." Panic rose within her. "You're deciding this without even asking what I want." He turned fully toward her, his expression surprisingly raw. "This isn't about what you want, Eva. It's about what I need to do to keep you safe." Eva felt breathless. For the first time, Daniel Carter wasn't speaking as a businessman. He was speaking as someone afraid of losing something important, someone who cared. And she realized in that moment, Daniel wasn't just protecting his heir. He was protecting her. And that realization frightened her more than any leak or threat ever could. The private jet sliced through the night sky, carrying Eva toward an unknown destination. The city she'd known now felt distant, dissolved into the horizon. She felt suspended, both physically and emotionally. Everything was moving too fast, with Daniel at the center of the storm, making every decision as though she had no say at all. Eva glanced at him, seated across the luxurious cabin, his eyes fixed intently on a tablet, reviewing documents and rapidly exchanging messages with Stephanie. He appeared cold and focused, but she could sense something beneath the surface, something about to break. "Are you going to tell me where we're going, or will you just dump me in some hideaway without explanation?" Eva finally asked. Daniel lifted his gaze, jaw tense. He took a deep breath before responding, as if holding something back. "We have an isolated property in the countryside. No journalists, no paparazzi, no threats." Eva laughed bitterly. "So, a prison then?" Daniel placed the tablet down, fixing her with an intense look. "It's safe." She crossed her arms defiantly, anger rising. "Safe for whom?" "You, so you can keep me away from the world, away from having any real say about my own life." Daniel pressed his lips together, clearly irritated. "You don't understand what's at stake." "Then help me understand," she challenged. He rubbed a hand across his face, exhausted. He didn't want to answer this time, because the truth was more complicated than any logical explanation he could give. Before either of them could continue, the pilot announced their imminent landing. Eva looked out the window and saw an open field, dense trees surrounding a large estate. The house was big, but different from the mansion they'd left. More secluded, more rustic, like a hidden refuge from the world. Stepping out of the plane, Eva felt the fresh night air surround her, the scent of damp earth and vegetation reminding her of a past that felt impossibly distant, when her life had been unpredictable, but at least hers. Daniel walked ahead, clearly expecting her to follow, but Eva didn't move. He stopped, turning back with a questioning glance. "What is it?" She crossed her arms firmly. "You really think you can just bring me here and expect me to accept everything without question?" He sighed, visibly tense. "I'm doing this to protect you, and I had no choice," she shot back. Daniel said nothing. Eva felt her frustration boil over. "I get that you're used to controlling everything, Daniel, but I'm not a piece on your chessboard." He narrowed his eyes, frustration breaking through. "If you were just a chess piece, Eva, I would have hidden you before the news broke." Her heart jumped. "But I didn't," he continued, stepping closer. "I tried keeping you near, tried protecting you without pulling you entirely from your life. But that's no longer an option." Eva's breathing quickened. He didn't want to admit it, but there was more to this than just their agreement. She looked him straight in the eye. "How long do you think you can keep me here? How long will you keep making decisions for me?" Daniel remained silent for too long. Then he said something that caught her completely off guard. "Until I know, no one can hurt you." Eva blinked, confused. He hadn't said, "until the baby is born." He hadn't said, "until this blows over." He said, "until I know no one can hurt you." And that meant, for the first time, Daniel Carter was protecting something beyond their contract. He was protecting her. The estate was large and silent, with high windows letting in the early morning light. But despite its beauty, Eva felt uneasy. Daniel spoke very little after their arrival, merely instructing security, reinforcing orders for absolute isolation, and disappearing into what looked like an improvised office. Eva, restless, wandered the house, exploring each room, desperately seeking some semblance of control. At the end of the hallway, she discovered a slightly ajar door. Curious, she pushed it open slowly. Inside was a nursery. Her heart skipped a beat as she stepped inside, fingertips lightly brushing the wooden furniture. The room wasn't completely finished yet, Boxes sat unopened in the corner, as though Daniel wasn't quite sure how to put it together. As though he wasn't quite sure how to handle the reality that he was truly going to have a child. Ava swallowed hard. Daniel had clearly considered this long before she knew she was pregnant. He had been preparing for the baby's arrival even without admitting it, to anyone, including himself. A soft click behind her made Eva spin around quickly. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching her quietly. "You already prepared a nursery," Eva whispered. Daniel inhaled deeply. "I needed to be ready." "For the baby, or what it represents?" she challenged gently. He averted his gaze briefly, running a hand through his hair. He didn't have an answer for that. Eva felt emotions swirl inside her, a complicated mix of anger and empathy she hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. "You can try hiding what you feel, Daniel," she said softly, gesturing around the room. "But this proves that, deep down, you already care." He stiffened, and for a second she thought he would argue, deny, put up another wall. Instead, his expression softened. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had changed, something more honest. "It scares me," he admitted quietly. Eva felt her breath catch. Daniel Carter, the man who never showed weakness, had just admitted his greatest fear. It wasn't the contract. It wasn't the media. It was caring. Eva didn't know how to respond, but in that moment, one thing became perfectly clear. Daniel wasn't merely struggling for control over the situation. He was battling something much deeper, something he could never control, and for the first time in his life, he knew it. The silence inside the nursery was heavy, filled with unspoken meaning. Eva was still processing Daniel's confession. "It scares me." 3 words she never imagined coming from someone like him. She studied him for a long moment, trying to understand what lay behind that tense expression. Daniel Carter was not a man who showed weakness, yet standing there in front of her, he didn't seem quite so unshakable. "Why does it scare you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Daniel looked away, as if searching elsewhere for the answer. He knew the reason, but didn't want to say it. "Because I can't afford to fail." His voice was low and firm, but beneath it lay a vulnerable edge. Eva frowned slightly. "And what exactly does failure look like to you, Daniel?" He sighed, running a hand over his face, clearly struggling internally. "If I care too much, I lose. It's always been that way." Eva felt a shiver run through her. He was speaking from experience. She stepped closer, holding his gaze firmly. "You think caring makes you weak?" Daniel laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "I think caring destroyed me once, and I refuse to let it happen again." Her heart tightened. He wasn't merely trying to maintain control, he was protecting himself, but there was something he hadn't realized yet. "You already care, Daniel." He stared at her, and for a brief moment he saw himself reflected clearly in her eyes, the undeniable truth. But before either could speak again, a knock at the door shattered the intimacy of the moment. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, quickly, rebuilding his usual emotional armor before turning around. Stephanie stood in the doorway, her face tight, holding a tablet. "We need to talk." Daniel took the tablet from her and glanced down, his expression darkening instantly. Eva sensed immediately something was terribly wrong. "Daniel?" She tried to get his attention, but he was already moving swiftly toward his office. Eva shot a questioning look at Stephanie. The assistant hesitated briefly. "The situation has escalated." Eva followed Daniel quickly, finding him in his office already on the phone, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. "I want this handled. Now," he commanded harshly. "Find out exactly who's behind this. No assumptions, facts only." He ended the call abruptly, tossing the phone onto the desk. Eva crossed her arms. "Are you going to tell me what's going on? Or do I have to find out through the news again?" Daniel rubbed his temples, visibly exhausted. The leak spread further than we thought. Now it's not just journalists, there are people interested in the baby. Eva's pulse quickened. What do you mean interested? He locked eyes with her. I mean, there are people who see this child as leverage. Eva's stomach twisted painfully. You're saying someone might use the baby against you? Daniel nodded slowly. I have enemies, Eva. People who wouldn't hesitate to exploit this situation as a power move. A chill ran down her spine. Everything made sense now. The urgency, the security measures, Daniel's paranoia. He knew this was possible all along. She covered her face with her hands, overwhelmed. So, what are you going to do now? Daniel stepped closer. I won't let anyone hurt you. Eva met his eyes, uncertain. You think you can really prevent that? He hesitated, the tension heavy between them, before saying something she hadn't expected. I can try. Eva held her breath. Daniel Carter never promised what he couldn't deliver. Yet here he was, promising her everything. That night, sleep eluded Eva entirely. She tossed restlessly, haunted by Daniel's words. If I care too much, I lose. What would happen if he allowed himself to lose? Eventually, giving up on sleep, Eva stepped out onto the balcony, breathing in the cool night air, hoping to clear her mind, yet her heart continued racing. Footsteps sounded behind her, and without turning she knew exactly who it was. Can't sleep either, she whispered softly. Daniel moved to stand beside her. Not while there are threats I haven't eliminated. Eva gave a faint laugh. You never switch off, do you? He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. I wasn't built for that. She observed his rigid expression, noting the mental exhaustion he wore openly now. Without thinking, she reached out and gently touched his arm. Daniel froze at the unexpected contact, momentarily unsure how to respond. Eva didn't withdraw. You don't have to carry everything alone. He turned toward her, their eyes locked intensely, the space between them charged with unspoken feelings. For the first time, Daniel didn't pull away. Eva felt her breath catch as he leaned slightly closer, not out of obligation or because of the contract, but because he simply couldn't fight it anymore. And Eva knew in that instant, if they crossed this line, nothing would ever be the same again. The silence between Eva and Daniel was electric, the air around them heavy with something neither wanted to admit but couldn't ignore. Daniel's eyes were locked on hers, and for the first time since this all began, Eva saw something she'd never seen before: hesitation. Daniel Carter, the man who controlled everything effortlessly, didn't know what to do with her, and that meant, for the first time, she was a risk he couldn't calculate. Eva felt her heart pounding in her chest, but kept her gaze steady. She didn't want to be another game to him. She didn't want this moment to be another reflection of his obsession with control. Daniel, she whispered softly. He blinked, snapping out of the trance, and stepped back. It was only a single step, but it allowed her to breathe again. He turned away, jaw clenched tightly. He was fighting himself. Eva felt her chest tighten. He didn't pull away because he didn't want her. He pulled away because he was afraid, and that hurt more than anything else. This can't happen. His voice was firm but not harsh. He was speaking more to himself than to her. Eva crossed her arms, frustration rising. Why not? He took a deep breath, carefully choosing his words. Because it's not part of the agreement. She laughed bitterly. The contract, of course. Daniel turned back toward her, his expression revealing something else. Something he was trying to hide, but she'd already seen. You're afraid of what you feel. He frowned but didn't deny it. Eva stepped closer. You think feeling something gives me power over you. But Daniel, you've already lost that fight. If you truly felt nothing, you wouldn't have stepped back. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. His eyes darkened. Then he did, something Eva didn't expect. He laughed, a short, bitter laugh, tinged with exhaustion and irony. "You make it sound simple, Eva." He stepped closer, his voice soft and intense, causing her breath to catch. "But it isn't. Nothing in my life is simple. You have no idea what it means for me to let someone get close." She felt her throat tighten. "Then help me understand." Daniel closed his eyes briefly before exhaling deeply. "This can only end one way." Eva lifted her chin defiantly. "And what way is that?" He held her gaze for too long, searching for the right words, trying to predict a future he couldn't see clearly. Then he whispered something that sent chills down her spine. "With you hating me." Eva felt a cold shiver run through her. He spoke with frightening certainty, as if he'd lived it before, as if he had no doubt he would eventually hurt her. For the first time, Eva saw clearly what terrified him more than losing control: being loved. The tension lingered heavily in the days that followed. Daniel avoided any personal interaction, immersing himself in meetings, strengthening security, and focusing on everything except her. But Eva wasn't fooled. This wasn't just about leaked information or Daniel's enemies, it was about her. He was running, not from danger, but from what he felt. Eva, on the other hand, felt herself pulled towards something she couldn't stop anymore. She didn't know when exactly it happened, but somewhere between signing the contract and being isolated at this estate, something had changed. She cared, and that scared her just as much as it scared him. On the third sleepless night at the estate, Eva wandered down to the kitchen for a glass of water. But as she reached the hallway, she heard voices coming from Daniel's office. The door was slightly ajar. She stopped, hearing Daniel's low, tense voice. "I don't care about the money. I want to know who's behind this." Silence. Then his voice deepened dangerously. "If they think they can use Eva against me, they're gravely mistaken." Eva's heart skipped a beat. He didn't say the baby. He said Eva. Her pulse quickened. Daniel Carter, who claimed to care for nothing but the legacy he was building, was fighting for her. She knew she should walk away, stop listening. But Daniel's next words made her freeze in place. "I'd do anything to protect her." Eva felt the air leave her lungs. Reality hit her hard. Daniel wasn't merely battling external threats. He was battling himself. And Eva knew clearly for the first time, when Daniel Carter finally broke through that barrier, there would be no turning back. Because he never did anything halfway. If he let Eva fully into his life, he would never let her go. Eva stood motionless behind the office door, heart racing. Daniel's words echoed clearly in her mind. "If they think they can use Eva against me, they're gravely mistaken." His voice carried conviction, a fierce, protective determination she hadn't expected. Eva realized, with a sudden intensity, that Daniel wasn't merely protecting his legacy. He was protecting her. She silently stepped away from the door, retreating to her room. Her mind spun relentlessly, overwhelmed by the truth she had just discovered. Throwing herself onto the bed, she stared at the ceiling, wrestling with emotions she'd fought hard to ignore. Daniel Carter wasn't just cold logic and contracts. He cared despite his every attempt not to, and that terrified her. The next day, Daniel disappeared, consumed by work and avoiding Eva entirely. He was running away again, not from the threat, but from himself. Eva spent the day in restless unease. She couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the memories of his voice, the intensity behind his words. The realization unsettled her deeply. She wanted Daniel, not for his power or his wealth, but for the man he hid beneath layers of control and detachment. He only returned late in the evening. Eva sat quietly on the terrace, staring at the darkened horizon when she heard his footsteps approaching. She didn't turn around. Daniel stopped a short distance away, hesitant. "Ava, You can keep running," she interrupted quietly, her voice firm but gentle. "You can pretend nothing's happening between us. But you know as well as I do." "That's a lie!" Daniel remained silent, clearly conflicted. She finally turned to face him. "I heard you last night." His expression froze. "You weren't supposed to hear that." "But I did." Ava rose slowly, closing the distance between them. "If I'm just part of a contract, if I mean nothing to you, then why would you risk so much to protect me?" Daniel's breathing quickened, his eyes conflicted. "Ava, this can't happen." "Why?" His jaw tightened. "Because I'm not capable of giving you what you deserve." Ava shook her head softly. "You keep telling yourself that. But the truth is, you've already lost that fight. If you felt nothing, you wouldn't keep running away." He looked at her intently, an internal battle raging visibly behind his eyes. Then, abruptly, he closed the remaining distance between them. Before Ava could react, his lips captured hers, the kiss sudden, intense, driven by a desperation neither could deny. Ava's mind spun, her heart pounding fiercely. For one perfect, terrifying moment, nothing else mattered. Not the contract, not the threats, just them, together, wrapped in something raw and real. When Daniel finally pulled away, both were breathing heavily. "This shouldn't have happened," he whispered roughly. Ava reached up, touching her lips, still feeling his presence there. But it did. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, conflicted. When he opened them, the vulnerability she'd glimpsed earlier was clear and unguarded. "I can't give you what you need, Ava." She held his gaze firmly. "How do you know what I need?" "Because I've seen how this ends," he whispered, voice thick with pain. "With you hating me." Her breath caught sharply. He spoke as if it had already happened, as if he were certain he'd ultimately hurt her. Ava shook her head, eyes soft but determined. "You're wrong." He seemed surprised by her quiet defiance. "You don't know me, Ava, not really." She gently touched his cheek, making him meet her eyes. "Then let me know you." For a moment, Daniel stood utterly still, vulnerable, exposed. Yet just as suddenly his defenses returned. He pulled back, creating distance again, rebuilding the emotional walls he relied upon. Ava felt frustration surge within her, but also compassion. Daniel Carter was not a man incapable of love. He was a man terrified by it. And now Ava faced a choice: wait patiently for him to break free from those chains, or walk away before it was too late. Because one thing was clear: if Daniel allowed himself to love her, there would be no turning back. Ava's lips still tingled from Daniel's kiss, the memory seared into her senses, yet his words echoed louder. "This shouldn't have happened. I can't give you what you need." Daniel Carter might have been a genius businessman and a master strategist, but when it came to feelings, he was nothing short of a coward. He'd kissed her with the intensity of someone holding back too long, then immediately retreated as if he'd committed a grave mistake, as if allowing himself to feel anything for her was riskier than all the enemies surrounding him. And that made Ava furious. "You can keep hiding, Daniel," she said firmly, masking the storm inside her, "but you can't pretend this didn't happen." His eyes darkened, filled with something he refused to name. "We're not talking about feelings. It was a mistake." Ava crossed her arms, frustration tightening her throat. "If it was a mistake, why does it seem like you're trying harder to convince yourself than me?" Daniel took a deep breath, clearly struggling for control. A control he'd already lost. She stepped closer, narrowing the distance between them. "You always talk about control, logic, avoiding weakness, but what if, just for a second, you stopped hiding behind these rules you created for yourself?" He stared at her silently, tension crackling between them. Then, in a voice barely audible, he murmured, "Because I know how this ends." Ava frowned, confused. And how does it end? Daniel's jaw tightened, his gaze sliding away. With you hating me. Silence filled the space between them, heavy and suffocating. Suddenly, Eva understood. Daniel Carter wasn't merely afraid of loving someone. He feared being loved. He believed that if he allowed himself to feel, he would inevitably hurt the one person capable of penetrating his defenses. Eva's heart clenched painfully. Do you really think feeling something for me will destroy me? He laughed bitterly. Don't you? I'm a man who takes what he wants, who controls everything around me. Do you honestly believe someone like me can love without dragging you into chaos? Eva held his gaze, silently willing him to see the truth. Daniel, she said softly, with raw honesty in her voice, you've already dragged me into your chaos. But the difference now is I don't want to leave. Daniel stared at her, momentarily lost. But then, predictably, he turned away, brushing past her as he left the terrace without another glance, as if escaping a fire he'd set himself. Eva stood frozen, refusing to shed a single tear. If Daniel wanted to sabotage himself, that was his choice. But she wasn't leaving. In the days that followed, Daniel avoided all personal interactions, burying himself in endless calls and meetings, as if immersing in work could erase the memory of what they'd shared. Eva, however, wasn't making it easy for him. She didn't confront him directly, but neither did she pretend nothing had happened. Every time he entered a room, she met his eyes. Every exchange, every glance lingered just long enough to remind him she wasn't going anywhere. And Daniel felt it. He felt her presence in subtle ways, the lingering scent of her perfume, the echo of her footsteps, the loud silence between them. He knew he couldn't avoid it forever, but before he could decide how to handle it, fate made the decision for him. Late one night, Eva woke to an unfamiliar sound. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but her intuition wouldn't settle. Slowly, she rose and approached the window. Her breath caught sharply. Lights. Movement. Someone was outside. Her stomach tightened painfully, and instinctively. She moved toward the door, but Daniel was already there, pushing it open urgently, his eyes sharp and alert. "Stay here," he ordered sharply, his voice darker than she'd ever heard it. "What's going on?" Eva asked, voice trembling. He pulled a gun from inside his jacket, making her blood run cold. "Daniel." He turned to her, his expression grave. This was no longer about journalists or leaked secrets. The threat had found them. This wasn't about contracts anymore. It was about survival. The silence in the room was suffocating. Eva's heart pounded as she watched Daniel expertly load his weapon, moving with a practiced precision that unsettled her deeply. He didn't seem hesitant at all. He looked prepared. And that frightened her more than the threat outside. "Daniel, tell me what's going on," she demanded, her voice steady, despite the fear tightening her throat. He held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, clearly weighing a decision. Finally, his expression hardened. "Stay here. Lock the door. Don't come out until I return." Eva felt a chill run down her spine. "And if you don't come back?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I always come back." He left the room before she could say another word. Eva rushed back to the window, peering outside. Shadows moved among the trees. She couldn't see how many there were, but knew their presence wasn't a coincidence. Quickly, she stepped back and locked the door as Daniel had ordered, though every instinct screamed it wasn't enough. Outside, Daniel moved through the hallway silently, his body tense, senses sharp. He had known this moment would come. He knew he couldn't hide Eva forever. Their enemies had found the hideaway. Now he had to end it once and for all. He descended the stairs silently, eyes scanning every corner of the house. His security team was positioned strategically, but Daniel knew better than to rely solely on them. As he approached the front door, he heard a distant gunshot. Glass shattered violently from a nearby window. Daniel immediately dropped low, pressing himself against the wall beside the door, muscles tense as he watched the shadows moving outside. 3 men, heavily armed, waiting for him to react, but they didn't realize who they were dealing with. Daniel raised his weapon, firing without hesitation. One of the attackers dropped instantly. The remaining 2 scattered, one ducking behind the fence, the other disappearing into the surrounding trees. Daniel sprinted through the garden, eyes sharply scanning the darkness. His heart raced, yet his mind was clear. He had to neutralize this threat before Eva was endangered. Then, from inside the house, Eva's scream pierced the night. Daniel's blood froze. Spinning quickly, he sprinted back toward the house. Inside, Eva had found it impossible to stay locked in the room. Driven by adrenaline, she'd opened the door, only to be grabbed roughly by the arm. She screamed again. Dragged into the hallway, her back pressed painfully against the wall by a masked intruder, she fought desperately. "Stay quiet. And this will be quick," he hissed. Eva refused to submit, summoning all her strength to knee the man hard in the stomach. He doubled over, just enough for her to break free. She ran, but he recovered too quickly. His hand grabbed her hair, yanking her backward violently. Eva cried out, struggling fiercely, yet knowing she couldn't escape on her own. A sudden gunshot echoed through the house. The intruder froze. Eva felt the grip on her hair loosen. She turned quickly, seeing Daniel standing at the end of the corridor, guns still raised, his gaze lethal. The intruder hesitated, calculating his chances, then released Eva and slowly raised his hands in surrender. Daniel advanced toward him, steps deliberate and cold, eyes dark with restrained fury. The enemy had found Eva, but they had fatally underestimated Daniel Carter. Daniel glanced briefly at Eva, ensuring she wasn't injured. She stood shaken, breathing heavily, but unharmed. Only then did he turn his attention to the man now kneeling on the ground. He crouched beside him, pressing the gun to the intruder's temple. "Who sent you?" The man didn't answer. Daniel pressed harder. "I don't ask twice." The intruder laughed bitterly. "You think it ends here?" Daniel didn't blink. "No, but it does for you." A sharp, final shot echoed. Eva held her breath. Daniel rose slowly, holstering the gun. He turned toward Eva, and for the first time there was nothing left between them. No barriers, no lies, no excuses. He approached her slowly, voice raw and real. "I told you I would do anything to protect you." Eva shivered, realizing, for the first time, how deeply he meant it. Daniel wasn't protecting a contract anymore. He was protecting what was already his. And at that moment, Eva knew her life would never be the same again. Eva couldn't look away. The intruder's body still lay on the ground, the acrid scent of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. But nothing was more intense than Daniel, standing before her, eyes blazing with something deeper than anger. He was furious, yes, but not at her. He was furious for her. A shiver ran down Eva's spine. For the first time, there were no barriers between them, no justifications, no excuses. Only the raw truth. Daniel Carter had killed a man to protect her, and that changed everything. She swallowed hard, breathing unevenly. "Daniel." He didn't move, didn't even blink, just watched her intently, assessing every small reaction. Eva knew this was the decisive moment. If she backed away now, if she showed any sign of fear, he would retreat forever. But Eva wasn't afraid. So without hesitation, she took a step toward him. Daniel remained rooted to the spot. She held his gaze, something undeniable growing within her. "This isn't just about safety anymore, is it?" He clenched his jaw, reluctant to admit it. But Eva already knew the answer. She took another step closer, bringing them dangerously near. "You brought me here to keep me safe," she whispered intensely. "But when did this become more than just a contract?" Daniel closed his eyes briefly, gathering strength. When he opened them, the coldness was gone. No more lies, no more masks. And then softly he spoke words that made Eva's heart nearly stop. From the moment I realized losing you would destroy me, the air rushed from her lungs. Daniel Carter, the man who had spent his life building walls, had just torn them all down. Eva didn't think. She simply reacted. She grabbed his shirt and pulled him closer, pressing her lips fiercely against his. Daniel didn't hesitate. He held her tightly, kissing her with desperate intensity, releasing everything they'd both suppressed for far too long. There was no logic, no contract, only them. When they finally parted, both were breathless. Daniel cupped her face gently, his gaze locked on hers. "This changes everything," he murmured. Eva nodded softly. "I know." He took a deep breath, and for the first time seemed truly at peace. Not because he had won, but because, finally, he had something worth losing everything for, and now he would never let her go. What did you think of this story? Give it a rating from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important to us. If you made it this far, comment chocolate. Only those who watched until the end will understand your message. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe. For more inspiring stories, leave a like and share it with someone you care about.